In this section, I want to talk to you about the social diseases. Now, what do I mean when I say a social disease? That's the euphemistic way of talking about sexually transmitted infections. Again, I know that the majority of you are probably not going to be going into healthcare, but some of you might. And if you're going into healthcare, I know a lot of times people talk about these as STDs, like sexually transmitted diseases, and it's even here in this little graphic. But the way that we actually like to talk about it now in healthcare is a sexually transmitted infection. Infection just has a little bit less of a stigma than disease. So, just to make your patients feel better. There are a number of different sexually transmitted infections. There are bacterial infections, viral infections, fungal infections, protozoan infections, and even insects. With the fungal, where jock itch and yeast infections, those can be transmitted sexually, but they can also be transmitted just through being alive, because these are fungi that are found everywhere. So we're not going to talk in a lot of detail about these two infections because they're not solely or even majority sexually transmitted, but the rest are. So when we talk about social diseases or sexually transmitted infections, one of the first things to think about is, how are these infections acquired? Well, it says so right in the name. So they are acquired through sexual contact. How can they be prevented? It depends on who you talk to. Some people say, don't have sex. That's clearly not realistic, because there are new human beings born all the time, and we know where the majority of those have come from. So then it's thinking about safe sexual practices. And what are safe sexual practices? What does that look like? And then, the other thing to think about is, why is there such a stigma? Sexually transmitted disease. Why are people embarrassed to talk about it? Why do you talk about, this person's clean, this person's dirty? So what is the stigma? And, again, this is a science GE class, but it's also a GE class to think about the broad implications of your education. And you've probably learned in other classes, maybe even through your own life experience, that there is a lot of, stigma is probably the best word I can think of, in people who have a sexually transmitted infection. It's not something you don't walk up to your classmate and be like, hey dude, I got diagnosed with gonorrhea last night. Like, that's not what you talk about, right? And it's because there can be a lot of shame around sexual practices. Particularly if people are engaged in sexual practices that are not seen as, quote unquote, right. So for, people who are gay, or people who are not married, or people who are with multiple partners, all of those types of things can cause people shame and stigma about their disease, about their infection. And so it's really important, if you are going into healthcare, but even if you're not going into healthcare, just as part of general society, it's not that big of a deal, what people do. And if you can help educate people on how to protect themselves and kind of reduce some of the stigma, people will seek treatment more frequently, which will lead to these diseases spreading less frequently. Okay, so first we'll talk about bacterial infections, and I call them the big three. So I did my PhD and postdoc in San Antonio. I grew up here, right, in the Valley. I never was a basketball fan. My family was more into baseball and football. But I would always root for the Kings when they played against the Lakers, because for whatever reason, I hated the Lakers. I still do. But when I went to San Antonio, there's really no football, there's no baseball. So you follow basketball, and of course you follow the Spurs. So in the early 2000s through 2015, 2016, these were the big three: Tony Parker, Manu Ginobili, and Tim Duncan. So that's why I included them as the big three. They are not infections, they are just basketball players. The infections that are the big three are syphilis, chlamydia, and gonorrhea. The reason I call them the big three is because in the US, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, the CDC, keeps a list of what we call reportable infections. So not every infection, not every infectious disease is reported to the CDC. Many are. These three are reported to the CDC. So if your doctor diagnoses you with one of these infections, your doctor has to report to the public health department, I diagnosed a patient. They don't say your name, they don't say anything about you, just a patient with this infection. So these three infections are the three most common reported infections in the US. They are the big three. So the first we'll talk about is syphilis. It's caused by a bacterium called Treponema pallidum. It looks like this, a little corkscrew. It's a spirochete. The disease, and here I don't mean disease like in a bad way, I just mean like the disease caused in your body. So the change in your body has different stages. Primary syphilis is characterized by a lesion on the genitals. And as awful as that lesion looks, it's often painless. So, in your patients with external genitalia, with male genitalia, you see the lesion. In patients with internal genitalia, you do not. So a lot of times, female patients don't know that they've been infected. With secondary syphilis, so if you haven't gotten the first stage treated, the bacteria will spread throughout your body and the lesion in the genitals goes away. And then secondary syphilis is characterized by lesions all over the body, like a full body rash. And all of these lesions are highly contagious because they all have the bacteria in them. And if you still don't get it treated, it moves on to what we call tertiary syphilis, where it spreads throughout the body. And here there's like a lesion in this patient's mouth. It can cause damage to bone. It goes to the brain. It makes people crazy. In the US, the darker the area, the more syphilis is present in the population in terms of like as a percentage of the population. And just for giggles, here's Fresno County. So the Central Valley, the Southeast, large urban centers tend to have higher levels of sexually transmitted infections than other parts of the country. So of course, Fresno County is there. Syphilis was first recorded in Europe in 1495. And so the question becomes, well, where was it before then? And the answer to that is that it was very likely in what they called the New World, so the Americas. So one of the prevailing theories, which doesn't mean it's true, but means there's a lot of evidence to support it, it's called the Columbian exchange theory. That when Columbus sailed the ocean blue in 1492 and came to the Americas, he and his crew gave everybody smallpox and killed pretty much all of the natives, which is a horrible, terrible thing. In return, the native population of the Americas at the time gave the crew syphilis, and they took it back to Europe. That's the prevailing theory. They call it the Columbian exchange theory. I don't think it's a fair trade. Syphilis is not nearly as bad as smallpox, but it is what it is. The U.S. has a history with syphilis, of bad things that the U.S. has done to people. One of those bad things is the Tuskegee syphilis experiment. This was done in Tuskegee in Alabama, where approximately 400 Black men were diagnosed with syphilis, but not told they had syphilis. And so the doctors, I put that in quotes because I don't think that's not a real doctor, it's a horrible person, would monitor the progression of syphilis in those patients, would monitor the development of syphilis in their sexual partners, like their wives, and monitor then the development of syphilis in their children. who were born to the infected mothers. Even after the development and discovery of penicillin, which worked really well against syphilis, they were not told they had syphilis, they were not given treatment, but it was okay to do this because they were poor and they were Black. So the US, not always very good. And then we did the same thing in Guatemala. So good times. Except at this point, of course, they weren't Black, they were Guatemalan. So US syphilis, ugly history. The next bacterium we'll talk about as part of the big three is gonorrhea. It's caused by a bacterium called Neisseria gonorrhoeae. It is the second most common reportable disease in the US. It's estimated to infect 0.1% of US teens, and then of course higher as you get older. Symptoms, if you experience them, would include discharge and pain, but many people are asymptomatic. And the problem is if you're asymptomatic, you don't know there's anything wrong, you're not going to seek treatment. And if you're not going to seek treatment, the infection can spread. And it is one of the leading causes of what is called pelvic inflammatory disease in female patients and can eventually lead to their infertility. And disseminated gonorrhea that gets to the joints, so out of the reproductive tract and into the joints, is a leading cause of arthritis in people under the age of 50. Okay, where do we find gonorrhea in the US? Well, dark blue, right? No, Central Valley, Southeast, and boom, Fresno County. One of the real challenges with gonorrhea at this point is the emergence and increase of drug-resistant gonorrhea that is not able to be treated very well with antibiotics. It doesn't respond to antibiotics anymore. And the CDC considers this one of the highest threat levels because if you can't treat it with antibiotics, it's going to continue to spread. And as it continues to spread, again, life-threatening ectopic pregnancy. When a female patient gets gonorrhea that goes into the uterus and into the fallopian tubes, and you get that pelvic inflammatory disease, it can cause scarring in the fallopian tubes, and that can prevent the fertilized egg from being able to travel through the fallopian tubes into the uterus to where it needs to go. And it can cause the fertilized egg to implant in the fallopian tube instead, which causes that ectopic pregnancy. And as the fetus implanted in the wrong place, right, the embryo, it continues to grow, it can cause the fallopian tube to rupture, and it can cause severe internal bleeding and kill the patient. But that scarring can also lead to infertility if a fertilized egg can never make it to the uterus again. Having gonorrhea also increases the risk of getting and giving HIV during sexual encounters. The final member of the big three is Chlamydia trachomatis, so it causes the disease chlamydia. It infects your cells, so it goes inside the cells. It doesn't stay outside like syphilis and gonorrhea. It is the most common reportable disease in the US. So if you go in order of most common, it's chlamydia, gonorrhea, and syphilis, then every other infection that people can get. It's estimated to be found in 0.5% of the US population, especially those between the ages of 15 and 29. So what are they doing? They're beginning to engage in sexual activity, perhaps with multiple partners. They haven't settled down into a monogamous relationship, and they may not be engaging in safe sex practices. The symptoms, even though the bacterium is really different, the symptoms are really similar to gonorrhea, where a lot of patients are asymptomatic, but if left untreated, it can lead to sterility. So I'm going to go through the next few slides pretty quickly. They're just propaganda posters from like the World War II era in seeking treatment and preventing sexually transmitted infections. So this one makes me laugh. 98% of procurable women have a venereal disease. Basically, they're saying prostitutes, right? If you can procure a woman, she may have a venereal disease, a booby trap, V-gals, bag of trouble. So the other thing I want to point out about this is it's always the woman's fault here. So in these propaganda posters, these were mostly geared towards US soldiers or UK soldiers who were primarily men. So they were basically telling the men, like, please stop engaging in sex with women while you're at war. So again, she may look clean, don't take chances with pickups. He picked up more than a girl. A sailor doesn't have to prove he's a man. There's no medicine for regret. Say no to prostitutes. Minute with Venus, a year with Mercury, because before antibiotics, the therapy was actually taking mercury, like metal, the mercury. But this one I thought was funny. All of these men have syphilis. Women, don't go to dance halls. Okay. And don't believe him. If a wise guy tells you that sexual intercourse is not dangerous, basically it says if she'll sleep with you, she'll sleep with someone else, she's probably diseased. Most prostitutes have venereal disease. And at this point, there were no antiseptics, prophylactic treatments, or other preventatives to ensure safety. Okay. Even though they could have worn a condom, that's fine. Chlamydia incidence in the US, again, hello. It is what it is. How do we treat and prevent bacterial sexually transmitted infections? Well, antibiotics are really good treatments for penicillin especially is a good treatment for syphilis and gonorrhea. Erythromycin is better for chlamydia, but again, that increased prevalence of drug-resistant gonorrhea is scary. So prevention, condoms. They also, recommend, especially if you are engaging in sexual activity with multiple partners, or perhaps you've begun having sexual activity with a new partner, that everybody go get tested periodically to ensure that you don't have one of these infections, because they don't cause symptoms. So sometimes you might not even know. So this way you can catch it early, get treated, and know that you don't have an infection running through your reproductive tract.